Throughout this scholarly examination, commentators David Brooks and Kimberly Atkins Storr delve into the seismic cultural and systemic reconfigurations currently defining the second administrative term of Donald Trump. Their dialogue serves as a critical postmortem and ongoing diagnostic of a nation grappling with a fundamental transition in how power is exercised and how social hierarchies are perceived. By dissecting the underlying currents of this era, they provide a nuanced framework for understanding the friction between traditional governance and a new, more assertive form of executive leadership. The discourse moves beyond mere partisan bickering to address the foundational pillars of the American Republic, questioning whether the current trajectory represents a temporary deviation or a permanent realignment. This analysis is essential for anyone seeking to navigate the complexities of contemporary American politics without falling into the traps of oversimplification or reactionary rhetoric. David Brooks posits that the palpable degradation of institutional efficacy and the entrenchment of a credentialed elite have fundamentally marginalized the working class, thereby catalyzing a global surge in popular sentiment. He explores the concept of state capacity, suggesting that when the machinery of government fails to deliver tangible results for the average citizen, the resulting vacuum is inevitably filled by movements that challenge the status quo. The meritocratic system, once viewed as a fair ladder for social mobility, is now often perceived as a closed loop that rewards a specific set of academic and professional credentials while ignoring the dignity of manual labor and local community wisdom. This perceived abandonment has created a deep-seated resentment that transcends borders, finding echoes in various nationalist movements across the developed world. Brooks argues that until the meritocracy addresses its own exclusionary nature, the populist fire will continue to burn with increasing intensity. Kimberly Atkins Storr shifts the focus toward the systematic dismantling of the rule of law, observing the profound ways in which federal bureaucracies and the highest judicial bodies have been recalibrated to serve partisan objectives and nationalist philosophies. She points to a concerning trend where the independence of the Department of Justice and other regulatory agencies appears compromised by a demand for personal and ideological loyalty. This shift, she suggests, threatens the very idea of a government of laws rather than of men, creating a precedent where legal interpretations are tailored to fit political outcomes. Furthermore, the transformation of the Supreme Court into a venue for significant policy shifts reflects a departure from its traditional role as a neutral arbiter of constitutional principles. Storr's critique emphasizes that the erosion of these boundaries does not just affect the present administration but sets a dangerous template for future governance. The participants in this dialogue collectively voice their deep-seated apprehensions regarding the atrophy of the civic architecture and the moral standards that have historically served as the bulwarks of democratic stability. They observe that the invisible guardrails of democracy, the unspoken agreements on conduct, honesty, and mutual respect, are being traded for short-term political gains. This weakening of the social fabric makes it increasingly difficult for institutions to function, as trust is the essential currency of any functioning republic. When the ethical norms that govern public life are discarded, the formal rules of the Constitution often prove insufficient to prevent the slide toward authoritarianism or dysfunction. The speaker suggests that the crisis is not merely political but spiritual, reflecting a loss of shared purpose and a common understanding of the common good. While Brooks retains a sense of cautious optimism regarding a potential era of civic revitalization and a long-term mending of the cultural rift, Storr maintains a more urgent posture, warning of the existential dangers facing the integrity of the electoral process. Brooks believes that the American people possess an innate capacity for self-correction, and that the current period of turmoil may eventually give way to a new era of community building and social cohesion. He looks toward local initiatives and grassroots movements as the potential seeds of a national coming together that could transcend current political divides. Conversely, Storr focuses on the immediate legal and procedural threats that could undermine the bedrock of democracy, the fair and free election. She argues that without robust protections and a commitment to nonpartisan administration of the vote, the very mechanism of democratic change is at risk. Ultimately, this intellectual exchange characterizes the present political climate as a moment of significant institutional fracture, necessitating a concerted and unified effort to restore a sense of national equilibrium and purpose. The speakers conclude that the challenges facing the United States are too great to be solved by any single leader or political party, requiring instead a broad-based commitment to institutional reform. This great rupture is seen as a turning point that will determine the character of the American experiment for decades to come. There is a sense of urgency in their call for citizens to look beyond their immediate grievances and work toward a sustainable vision of a pluralistic society. The dialogue serves as both a warning and a potential roadmap for those who believe that the preservation of democracy requires more than just passive observation. The historical context of David Brooks' analysis relies heavily on the evolution of the American dream from a collective promise of stability to a hyper-competitive race for status. He suggests that the technocratic elite, while efficient in managing complex systems, has lost the ability to communicate with and respect those who do not share their educational background. This cultural gap has become a geographical one as well, with urban centers of innovation increasingly isolated from the rural and industrial heartlands. Brooks argues that this diploma divide is the most significant cleavage in modern politics, more potent than race or religion in many instances. By failing to value the contributions of the non-credentialed, the meritocracy has inadvertently engineered its own opposition. In Storr's view, the current administrative approach to federal power represents a departure from the post-Watergate consensus that emphasized agency independence. She notes that the rhetoric of the deep state has been utilized to justify the removal of career civil servants and the installation of political loyalists in key positions. This centralization of power within the executive branch reduces the checks and balances that were designed to prevent the abuse of authority. Storr is particularly concerned with the potential for the weaponization of the federal government against domestic political rivals, a move that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the state and the citizenry. The legal arguments being used to support this expansion of power are, in her estimation, a direct challenge to the traditional understanding of the separation of powers. The discussion also touches upon the role of the media and the digital public square in accelerating the breakdown of civic norms. Both analysts recognize that the fragmentation of the information ecosystem has made it nearly impossible to maintain a shared set of facts, which is a prerequisite for any meaningful debate. Brooks laments the loss of middle ground institutions that used to facilitate national conversations, while Storr highlights how disinformation is used as a tool to undermine confidence in democratic institutions. They agree that without a return to a more disciplined and ethical public discourse, the chances of achieving national reconciliation remain slim. The outage of truth is as much a threat to the Republic as any legislative or judicial change. Furthermore, the dialogue explores the psychological toll that this period of instability has taken on the American public, noting a rise in cynicism and a decline in institutional trust across the board. When citizens no longer believe that the system is capable of producing fair results, they become more susceptible to radical solutions and charismatic leaders who promise to break the system. Brooks argues that the restoration of trust must begin with a demonstration of competence. The government must actually solve problems that matter to people's daily lives. Storr, however, insists that competence without a commitment to the rule of law is simply efficient authoritarianism. Their debate highlights the delicate balance between the need for an effective state and the necessity of a constrained state. As the second term progresses, the speakers observe that the norm-breaking behavior of the past has now become the norm-setting behavior of the present. What were once considered shocking departures from tradition are now integrated into the standard operating procedure of the executive branch. This normalization of radicalism makes it difficult for the public to stay engaged or outraged, leading to a form of outrage fatigue that benefits those in power. Storr points out that this is a common tactic in the erosion of democratic standards, the slow, incremental change that eventually leads to a point of no return. Brooks, however, remains fascinated by the possibility that this disruption could lead to a productive creative destruction of outdated institutions. The tension between these two perspectives, one focusing on the loss of stability and the other on the potential for renewal, summarizes the current American dilemma. There is a profound sense that the old ways of doing things are no longer adequate, but no consensus has emerged on what should replace them. The populist moment is seen not just as a protest, but as a demand for a fundamentally different kind of representation. Whether the current administration can deliver on that demand without destroying the foundations of the state remains the central question of the era. This dialogue, therefore, is not just an analysis of the present but a meditation on the future of self-governance in an age of deep division. In the coming years, the impact of judicial appointments made during this period will likely be the most enduring legacy of the current administration. Storr emphasizes that the shift toward an originalist and nationalist jurisprudence will affect everything from environmental regulation to civil rights for a generation. These changes are being implemented through a deliberate strategy of filling the benches with young, ideological jurists who are skeptical of the administrative state. Brooks acknowledges the significance of this shift, but suggests that the courts are merely reflecting a deeper social shift away from liberal internationalism. He argues that the legal system cannot be separated from the cultural milieu in which it operates. The international implications of this domestic shift are also a point of concern, as the retreat from global leadership and traditional alliances changes the geopolitical landscape. The America First philosophy, while popular with a significant portion of the domestic electorate, creates a vacuum that other global powers are eager to fill. Brooks notes that the rise of populism in the US is part of a broader global nationalist movement that challenges the post-WWII international order. This realignment suggests that the era of globalization as we knew it is over, replaced by a more transactional and competitive world. Storr warns that without a commitment to international law and democratic norms abroad, the US loses its moral authority to defend those same principles at home. As this segment of the discussion concludes, the emphasis remains on the agency of the individual citizen in a time of institutional decline. Both Brooks and Storr agree that the health of a democracy depends ultimately on the character of its people and their willingness to engage in the difficult work of citizenship. They argue that the current crisis is a call to action for those who believe in the ideals of the American Republic to step up and defend them. Whether through local community involvement, political activism, or simply a commitment to honest discourse, the path forward requires a renewed sense of responsibility. The brokenness of the current era is not an ending, but a challenge that demands a creative and courageous response. David Brooks articulates a compelling theory suggesting that the contemporary American state has lost its fundamental ability to execute large-scale projects and deliver basic efficiency to its citizens. This decline in state capacity is not merely a budgetary issue but represents a deep-seated institutional paralysis where bureaucracy prioritizes process over actual outcomes. When the government appears incapable of solving perennial problems like infrastructure decay or healthcare accessibility, the public's faith in the entire democratic project begins to evaporate. Brooks argues that this perceived incompetence creates a fertile ground for populist leaders who promise to dismantle a system that no longer seems to work for the common man. The administrative state has, in his view, become so entangled in its own regulations that it can no longer respond to the urgent needs of the working class. This institutional failure is inextricably linked to the rise of what Brooks calls the meritocratic caste system, which has fundamentally reorganized American social hierarchies. In this new social order, academic credentials and professional titles have become the primary markers of status, replacing the old-moneyed aristocracy with a new cognitive elite. While the meritocracy was originally intended to be a fair and open ladder for social mobility, it has instead solidified into a hereditary system where the children of the educated elite enjoy overwhelming advantages. This shift has created a profound diploma divide, effectively splitting the country into those who have mastered the language of the elite and those who feel increasingly ignored by it. The result is a nation where social status is no longer earned through diverse forms of labor but is guarded by expensive degrees and exclusive professional networks. The alienation of the working class is the direct byproduct of this meritocratic shift, as millions of Americans feel that their traditional values and way of life are being actively mocked by the bicoastal elite. Brooks suggests that this sense of being looked down upon is a more powerful political motivator than any specific economic policy or tax incentive. When people feel that their dignity is being stripped away by a system that only values technical expertise, they naturally gravitate toward movements that promise to restore their sense of place. This cultural resentment is not unique to the United States, but has become a defining characteristic of populist surges across Europe and the rest of the developed world. The working class has, in many ways, been orphaned by a political establishment that views them more as data points than as citizens with inherent worth. This global rise of populism serves as a direct rebuke to the technocratic arrogance that has dominated global governance for the last several decades. Brooks notes that the elite class often responds to populist anger with further condescension, which only serves to deepen the existing cultural and political fissures. By framing the conflict as one between enlightened experts and misinformed masses, the meritocracy further isolates itself from the very people it seeks to govern. This cycle of mutual suspicion makes it nearly impossible to build the broad coalitions necessary for significant national reform or social progress. The populist fire is therefore not an aberration but a predictable reaction to a system that has systematically excluded non-credentialed voices from the halls of power. Brooks points out that the decline in state capacity is particularly evident in the government's inability to build the tangible things that once defined American progress. From high-speed rail to affordable housing, the machinery of the state seems geared toward preventing action rather than facilitating it through endless layers of review and litigation. This vetocracy ensures that even the most well-intentioned policies are bogged down in years of administrative red tape before a single brick is laid. For the average worker in a struggling industrial town, this looks like a government that is more concerned with protecting the interests of lawyers and lobbyists than with creating jobs. This failure of execution provides the ultimate justification for those who wish to drain the swamp and return power to the people. The psychological impact of being trapped at the bottom of a meritocratic hierarchy cannot be overstated, as it fosters a sense of permanent inferiority and hopelessness among the non-elite. Brooks argues that when we tell people that their worth is entirely dependent on their test scores and professional success, we create a society of winners and losers with no middle ground. This hyper-competitive environment erodes the bonds of community and mutual respect that are essential for a healthy and functioning democracy. Those who are successful in this system often become blind to their own advantages, attributing their status entirely to their own merit while ignoring the structural support that made it possible. Conversely, those who do not succeed are left with the crushing feeling that their failure is entirely their own fault, leading to a rise in deaths of despair and social isolation. State capacity is also hindered by a loss of institutional memory, as career civil servants are increasingly replaced by political appointees or private contractors who lack a long-term commitment to the public good. Brooks observes that the professionalization of politics has led to a situation where the people running the government are more interested in their own career trajectories than in the stability of the institutions they lead. This lack of deep-rooted expertise means that when a crisis hits, the government often lacks the necessary boots on the ground and technical know-how to respond effectively. The hollowed-out state is then forced to rely on external consultants, which further reduces transparency and accountability while driving up costs for the taxpayer. This erosion of public service as a noble calling is a central theme in Brooks' critique of the modern American political landscape. Furthermore, the geographical concentration of the meritocratic elite in a few major metropolitan hubs has left the rest of the country feeling like flyover territory. This spatial segregation means that the people making the laws and managing the economy rarely interact with the people who are most affected by their decisions. Brooks argues that this physical distance reinforces the cultural and intellectual distance that already exists between the different social classes in America. When a policy is designed in a high-rise in Manhattan for a family living in rural Ohio, there is an inevitable disconnect that leads to unintended consequences and public backlash. The lack of shared experience between the governing and the governed is perhaps the greatest threat to national unity in the 21st century. The rise of global populism is, at its core, a demand for the restoration of national sovereignty and the protection of local identity against the forces of globalization. Brooks notes that the meritocratic elite tends to be citizens of the world, who value international mobility and global institutions over local ties and traditional heritage. This globalist outlook is often at odds with the needs of workers whose livelihoods are tied to specific industries and locations that have been decimated by outsourcing. By prioritizing the efficiency of global markets over the stability of local communities, the elite has effectively traded the security of the working class for their own prosperity. Populist movements offer a return to the home and the familiar, providing a sense of belonging that the cold logic of the meritocracy cannot offer. As the second term of Donald Trump continues to unfold, these tensions between the elite and the populace are being pushed to their absolute breaking point. Brooks suggests that the current administration's anti-institutional rhetoric is not just a political tactic but a reflection of the deep-seated anger that millions of Americans feel toward the system. Whether this period of disruption leads to a genuine renewal of the state or simply more chaos depends on whether the elite can learn to share power and respect their fellow citizens. The challenge for the future is to rebuild a state that is both efficient and inclusive, moving beyond the narrow confines of the meritocratic ideal. This requires a fundamental rethink of how we value human contribution and how we structure our educational and economic systems to serve the many, not just the few. The conversation between Brooks and Storr highlights the fundamental disagreement over whether the problem lies in the people or the structures of government. While Brooks focuses on the social and cultural roots of the crisis, he acknowledges that the institutional rot has made the problem significantly worse. He warns that a state that cannot provide for its people will eventually lose the mandate to govern, leading to a great rupture that could take generations to mend. This rupture is already visible in the breakdown of civil discourse and the increasing radicalization of political movements on both sides of the aisle. For Brooks, the only way forward is a civic renaissance that restores the dignity of work and the capacity of the state to serve the common good. In this context, the meritocracy has become its own worst enemy by failing to live up to the promise of equal opportunity it once championed. Brooks describes how the merit in meritocracy has been redefined to favor a very specific set of cognitive skills that are easily passed down through wealth and privilege. This has turned the American dream into a closed loop where the winners take all and the losers are left with nothing but resentment. The decline of state capacity is the inevitable result of this focus on elite interests at the expense of the broader public interest. When the smartest people in the room are only talking to each other, they lose the ability to see the world as it actually is for the majority of the population. This segment of the discussion underscores the urgent need for a new social contract that addresses the profound imbalances created by the meritocratic era. Brooks argues that we must move toward a communitarian model of governance that prioritizes local resilience and shared national identity. This involves not only policy changes but a shift in the moral and cultural values that define our society. We must learn to value character and contribution as much as we value IQ and earnings, creating a more holistic understanding of human success. Without this shift, the populist wave will continue to grow, fueled by the very inequality that the meritocracy claims to solve but actually perpetuates. The future of the American experiment hangs in the balance as we navigate this period of intense institutional and social friction. Brooks remains cautiously optimistic that the current crisis will force a necessary re-evaluation of our national priorities and a return to the principles of fair play and mutual respect. However, he also warns that the path to renewal is fraught with danger and requires a level of political courage that is currently in short supply. The Great Rupture is a challenge to all citizens to look beyond their narrow self-interest and work toward a more sustainable and equitable future for the nation. As we move into the next phase of this analysis, we will see how Kimberly Atkins Storr's concerns about the rule of law complement this sociological critique. Kimberly Atkins Storr offers a sobering assessment of the legal landscape, arguing that the traditional framework of three co-equal branches of government has been fundamentally compromised. She observes that the executive branch has aggressively expanded its footprint, effectively eclipsing the oversight roles historically played by Congress and the federal courts. This centralization of authority is not merely an administrative shift, but a deliberate effort to bypass the checks and balances that define the American constitutional order. Storr suggests that when the presidency becomes the sole locus of meaningful decision-making, the very definition of a republic begins to shift toward a more unitary model of governance. The result is a system where legal constraints are increasingly viewed as obstacles to be navigated rather than boundaries to be respected. Central to Storr's critique is the profound impact of recent Supreme Court rulings that have provided the executive with an unprecedented degree of legal immunity for official acts. She contends that this judicial shield has fundamentally altered the psychological and operational calculus of the current administration, fostering a sense of being above the law. In her view, the court's willingness to grant such broad latitude has signaled a departure from the principle that no individual, regardless of office, is immune from accountability. This jurisprudential shift creates a vacuum where presidential power can be exercised without the threat of post facto legal consequences, provided the actions are characterized as official duties. Storr warns that such a precedent effectively dismantles the post-Watergate consensus that sought to constrain executive overreach through robust judicial review. The transformation of the Department of Justice represents another critical pillar of Storr's analysis of the current era. She notes that the historical norm of prosecutorial independence has been replaced by a demand for personal loyalty to the executive's political and legal objectives. This shift turns the nation's primary law enforcement agency into a potential tool for partisan utility, where investigations can be directed or stifled based on political alignment. By gutting the institutional safeguards that once separated the Attorney General from the President's immediate political circle, the administration has fundamentally redefined the rule of law. For Storr, this politicization of justice is the most immediate threat to the democratic norms that ensure equal treatment under the legal system. Beyond the high-profile judicial battles, Storr points to the systematic remaking of the federal bureaucracy through the reclassification of thousands of civil service positions. This maneuver, often referred to as the implementation of Schedule F, seeks to replace nonpartisan experts with ideological loyalists across the administrative state. Storr argues that this purge of expertise weakens the state's ability to function independently of the current political winds, particularly in agencies like the CDC, EPA, and Federal Reserve. When career professionals are silenced or removed for presenting data that conflicts with the executive's narrative, the government loses its capacity for objective self-correction. This transformation ensures that the machinery of the state serves the immediate will of the leader rather than the long-term interests of the public. The judiciary's role has shifted from being a neutral arbiter to appearing, in many instances, as a supportive partner in the administration's nationalist agenda. Storr observes that the rapid appointment of young, ideologically committed jurists across the federal bench ensures that this legal realignment will persist for decades. These judges often embrace a narrow interpretation of constitutional law that prioritizes executive prerogative over individual liberties or legislative intent. This strategy effectively creates a legal echo chamber where the administration's most controversial policies are met with favorable rulings from a sympathetic bench. For Storr, the long-term consequence of this bench filling is the erosion of public trust in the courts as a final refuge for justice. Storr is particularly concerned about the implications of these changes for the integrity of future electoral processes and the peaceful transfer of power. She highlights how legal challenges to mail-in voting and voter registration are being used to reshape the electorate in favor of the current administration. These efforts, combined with a rhetoric that undermines the legitimacy of election results, create a volatile environment for the fundamental mechanism of democracy. Storr argues that if the legal rules governing elections are seen as partisan tools, the very concept of a fair and free vote becomes a casualty of the political struggle. The protection of the franchise is, in her estimation, the most critical battlefront in the effort to preserve the American democratic experiment. The over-federalization of criminal law is also a key theme in Storr's analysis, as she notes how federal power is being used to intervene in traditionally state and local matters. This includes the use of federal agents for domestic law enforcement and the expansion of federal crimes to include activities that were once the sole province of local jurisdictions. Storr suggests that this expansion of federal police power serves to bypass local accountability and project executive force more directly into the lives of citizens. By using the federal legal system to target dissent or enforce specific cultural agendas, the administration risks turning the law into a weapon of social control. This trend reflects a broader move toward a more centralized and punitive state that prioritizes order over constitutional protections. Storr's perspective contrasts sharply with Brooks' more sociological focus on the diploma divide and the failure of the meritocracy. While Brooks looks at the cultural causes of populism, Storr focuses on the technical and legal mechanics of how that populism is being translated into permanent state power. She argues that even if the cultural rift were to heal, the institutional damage currently being done could take generations to repair. The laws, regulations, and judicial precedents being established today will define the limits of American power long after the current administration has left office. Therefore, she maintains that a focus on legal accountability and structural reform is the only way to prevent a total collapse of the democratic system. The conversation between these two analysts reveals a deep anxiety about the long degradation of American institutions that has been accelerating in recent years. Storr argues that there may not be a single red flag moment that signals the end of democracy, but rather a slow, incremental erosion of the rule of law. Each decision to ignore a subpoena, fire a whistleblower, or appoint an unqualified loyalist contributes to this cumulative decline. When these actions become normalized, the public's expectations of government behavior are lowered, making further abuses easier to execute. Storr's work is a call to recognize these patterns before they become an irreversible part of the American political fabric. Furthermore, Storr explores how the rhetoric of the deep state is used to delegitimize any institutional resistance to the executive's will. By framing expert agencies as inherently corrupt or part of a hidden conspiracy, the administration justifies the dismantling of those very institutions. Storr notes that this narrative is particularly effective because it taps into the genuine frustrations of citizens who feel ignored by a complex and often opaque bureaucracy. However, the solution of replacing nonpartisan experts with political operatives only replaces one form of perceived distance with another form of active bias. This erosion of institutional integrity makes it impossible for the government to provide the objective analysis required for sound policymaking. The international dimension of this shift is equally concerning to Storr, as she observes the US retreating from global legal frameworks and human rights norms. By prioritizing a nationalist and transactional approach to international law, the administration undermines the very structures it helped build after World War II. Storr argues that this domestic disregard for the rule of law inevitably bleeds into the nation's foreign policy, reducing its moral authority on the world stage. When the United States no longer champions democratic values and legal standards abroad, it emboldens authoritarian movements globally. This creates a feedback loop where the global retreat from democracy further reinforces the nationalist trends at home. As the second term progresses, Storr observes that the legal system is being tested in ways that were previously unimaginable. The great rupture mentioned earlier is manifest in the daily friction between those attempting to uphold traditional legal norms and those seeking to redefine them. Storr highlights the courage of the resistors within the government, those who refuse to carry out orders that violate their oath of office or the Constitution. These individuals, she suggests, are the last line of defense in a system that is rapidly losing its structural integrity. However, their numbers are dwindling as the administrative purge continues to sweep through the ranks of the civil service. The dialogue ultimately frames the current era as a period of profound legal and institutional vulnerability. Storr's analysis serves as a detailed mapping of the points of failure within the American system that are currently being exploited. She insists that the preservation of the Republic requires more than just winning the next election. It requires a complete restoration of the rule of law. This involves a renewed commitment to the independence of the judiciary, the neutrality of law enforcement, and the integrity of the civil service. Without these foundations, the civic renaissance envisioned by Brooks remains a distant and unlikely dream. In conclusion to this segment, Storr's warnings focus on the immediate and tangible threats posed by the current administrative trajectory. She characterizes the legal changes not as isolated events, but as part of a coherent strategy to reshape the American state into a more authoritarian-leaning entity. The erosion she describes is a deliberate process of dismantling the barriers to executive power. As we prepare for the next part of this analysis, we will synthesize these legal concerns with the broader social and cultural implications of this institutional shift. The tension between Brooks' hope for renewal and Storr's warning of collapse continues to define the national discourse. David Brooks maintains a persistent, if cautious, belief that the current era of institutional collapse will eventually pave the way for a grassroots movement dedicated to social and moral reconstruction. He identifies the weavers of society, those local leaders, neighbors, and volunteers who work quietly to rebuild trust, as the primary agents of this future cultural healing. These individuals operate outside the glare of the national political theatre, focusing instead on the immediate needs of their local communities and neighborhoods. Brooks suggests that while the national discourse remains toxic and polarized, these local efforts represent the true heart of a potential American renewal. He argues that by shifting our focus from federal power struggles to community-level engagement, we can begin to mend the frayed edges of the social fabric. This hope for a civic renaissance is rooted in the idea that the great rupture currently being experienced is a necessary, albeit painful, stage of civilizational evolution. Brooks posits that the old social contract, which prioritized hyper-individualism and technocratic merit, has reached its logical and dysfunctional conclusion. The resulting loneliness and social isolation have created a vacuum that is currently being filled by anger and populist resentment. To counter this, he calls for a new moral ecology that values relationship building and mutual responsibility over mere professional achievement or political dominance. This transition requires a fundamental change in how Americans perceive their role as citizens, moving from passive consumers of political content to active participants in community life. The concept of the diploma divide remains a central obstacle to this vision, as it continues to segregate the nation into two distinct and increasingly hostile social classes. Brooks observes that the meritocratic elite has created its own secular church, with its own jargon, rituals, and exclusive pathways to success. This cultural isolation has left millions of working-class Americans feeling like strangers in their own country, leading them to embrace leaders who promise to burn the system down. A genuine civic renaissance would require the elite to recognize their own role in this alienation and to actively work to dismantle the barriers they have built. Without a sincere effort to restore the dignity of manual labor and local wisdom, any attempt at national reconciliation will likely remain superficial and ineffective. Image representing the weaving of diverse social threads into a unified national fabric. Kimberly Atkins Storr, however, provides a necessary reality check to this optimistic vision by highlighting the immediate and systemic threats to the democratic process. She argues that while local community building is essential, it cannot substitute for the protection of the legal and procedural guardrails that ensure free and fair elections. If the machinery of the state is being actively dismantled or weaponized, the efforts of local weavers may be overwhelmed by the sheer force of institutional decay. Storr points to the ongoing efforts to restrict voting access and politicize the administration of elections as evidence that the foundations of democracy are under direct assault. In her view, the civic renaissance must be paired with a rigorous defense of the rule of law if it is to have any lasting impact. The tension between these two perspectives defines the current American moment. One looks toward a long-term cultural shift, while the other sounds the alarm on immediate structural threats. Brooks acknowledges that the rippers, those who thrive on division and the destruction of norms, currently hold significant power in the national conversation. These figures utilize the tools of modern media and the reach of the executive branch to amplify grievances and undermine shared truths. To overcome this, Brooks suggests that a counter-movement of weavers must find a way to make the work of community building as compelling and visible as the work of disruption. This involves creating new institutions and revitalizing old ones, such as schools, churches, and civic clubs, to serve as laboratories for social trust. The role of the information ecosystem is another area where the two analysts find common ground regarding the difficulty of the task ahead. They agree that the fragmentation of media has made it nearly impossible for the nation to engage in a shared conversation about its future. When different segments of the population live in entirely different factual realities, the possibility of a collective action to restore stability remains elusive. Storr emphasizes that the deliberate spread of disinformation is a key tactic used to destabilize institutions and confuse the electorate. Brooks, meanwhile, laments the loss of the common square where Americans of different backgrounds used to meet and deliberate on the common good. Furthermore, the discussion explores the psychological toll of living in a society that is constantly at war with itself. Brooks notes a pervasive sense of moral exhaustion among the public, as the constant cycle of outrage and crisis drains the energy needed for productive civic engagement. This exhaustion often leads to a retreat into private life or a surrender to cynicism, both of which benefit those who wish to exercise power without accountability. The proposed civic renaissance would require a re-energizing of the public spirit, perhaps through a shared national mission or a renewed commitment to pluralism. This would involve teaching the skills of democratic disagreement, where citizens can debate fiercely without viewing their opponents as existential threats. The second term of Donald Trump has accelerated these trends, turning what were once academic debates into urgent matters of national survival. Storr observes that the normalization of radicalism in the executive branch has set a new baseline for what is considered acceptable political conduct. This shift makes the work of the weavers even more difficult, as the incentives for division often outweigh the rewards for cooperation in the current political economy. However, Brooks argues that it is precisely during times of maximum friction that the most significant cultural changes often occur. He looks back at the history of the United States and finds previous eras of deep division that were followed by periods of intense social reform and renewal. The challenge for the future is to build a modern meritocracy that values character, curiosity, and contribution as much as it values standardized test scores. Brooks suggests that our current evaluation systems are too narrow, failing to recognize the immense potential of those who do not fit the traditional mold of the educated elite. By broadening our definition of merit, we can begin to heal the class-based wounds that have fueled the populist surge. This would involve a significant overhaul of the education system, from primary schools to universities, to focus more on the formation of citizens and less on the production of specialized workers. Such a shift would move us away from a sorting system and toward a system of genuine human development. Collective action, in this context, means more than just voting or participating in protests. It means taking personal responsibility for the health of one's own community. Brooks believes that the path to national stability begins with a series of small, local victories that demonstrate the possibility of cooperation across lines of difference. These victories create a contagion of trust that can slowly spread upward through the social and political layers of the country. Storr, while supportive of this goal, insists that these efforts must be protected by a robust and independent legal system that prevents the abuse of power. Their dialogue suggests that the restoration of the nation requires both a bottom-up cultural movement and a top-down defense of institutional integrity. As we move toward the final conclusion of this dialogue, the emphasis remains on the existential choice facing the American people. They can either continue down the path of fragmentation and institutional decay, or they can choose the difficult work of national reconciliation. The Great Rupture is not just a political crisis but a challenge to the very idea of a self-governing people. Both Brooks and Storr agree that the outcome is not preordained and will depend on the actions of individuals and groups in the coming years. The current era of brokenness is an opportunity to build something more resilient and inclusive than what came before. The dialogue between Brooks and Storr serves as a powerful reminder that the health of a democracy is never guaranteed and requires constant maintenance. By diagnosing the root causes of our current dysfunction, from the failure of the meritocracy to the erosion of the rule of law, they provide a roadmap for potential recovery. While they differ on the specific focus and timeline of this recovery, they share a deep commitment to the ideals of the American Republic. Their exchange highlights the necessity of both moral imagination and legal rigor in the face of an uncertain future. This period of disruption, while dangerous, may eventually be seen as the catalyst for the civic renaissance that Brooks so desperately hopes for. In the final installment of this analysis, we will synthesize these ideas into a comprehensive vision for the future of American democracy. We will examine the final warnings provided by both analysts and their ultimate calls for collective action and institutional reform. The Great Rupture is a turning point, and the next few years will determine whether the nation emerges stronger or continues its slide into dysfunction. As we conclude this segment, the focus remains on the possibility of renewal and the enduring strength of the American experiment. The path forward is difficult, but the potential for a more perfect union remains the guiding light for those who refuse to give up on the promise of democracy. In the final analysis, This intellectual exchange ultimately frames the contemporary political landscape as an era of profound and pervasive institutional fracture. This great rupture is not merely a transient period of disagreement, but a fundamental breaking of the social and political bonds that have historically held the nation together. The participants suggest that the traditional mechanisms of consensus have been replaced by a state of permanent friction, where every administrative action is viewed through the prism of existential conflict. This era is characterized by a systemic distrust that penetrates every level of governance, from the highest courts to the smallest local councils. Consequently, the dialogue posits that the American project has reached a critical juncture where the old ways of doing business are no longer sufficient to maintain order. David Brooks argues that this period of instability is the culmination of a long degradation that began well before the current administration took office. He traces the roots of this decay to the early 2010s, noting that the rise of global populism was a predictable response to the perceived failures of the neoliberal order. This erosion is not a sudden switch that can be flipped back, but a slow and steady wearing away of the norms that once constrained political behavior. In his view, the rupture is a sign that the historical tides of populism and nationalism have finally breached the levees of institutional resistance. Therefore, the current era must be understood as a structural realignment rather than a temporary deviation from the norm. Kimberly Atkins Storr complements this view by focusing on the specific legal and procedural mechanics that have facilitated this institutional breakdown. She emphasizes that the rupture is most visible in the executive branch's aggressive pursuit of judicial immunity and the centralization of administrative power. These changes create a new legal reality where the traditional concepts of accountability and transparency are increasingly difficult to enforce. For Storr, the danger lies in the normalization of these radical shifts, which effectively redefines the relationship between the state and its citizens. She warns that without a rigorous defense of the rule of law, the rupture could become a permanent feature of the American governing landscape. The speakers collectively argue that the restoration of national stability will require a level of collective action that transcends the boundaries of partisan politics. This action must go beyond the ballot box and involve a fundamental reinvestment in the civic and social structures that support a healthy democracy. They suggest that the great rupture cannot be mended by a single leader or policy, but requires a broad-based commitment to institutional reform and cultural healing. This involves a willingness to engage in the difficult work of pluralism, where citizens of differing views can coexist within a shared set of democratic rules. Ultimately, the dialogue frames the current crisis as a challenge to the agency and character of the American people themselves. Collective action in this era means more than just participating in the political process. It requires the creation of new forms of social trust and community engagement. Brooks notes that the weavers of society, those working at the local level to mend relationships, are the essential counterparts to the rippers who dominate the national headlines. By focusing on local resilience and shared purpose, citizens can begin to build a foundation for national stability that is not dependent on federal politics. This bottom-up approach is seen as the only viable path to overcoming the deep-seated cultural and economic divisions that fueled the rupture in the first place. The restoration of stability, therefore, is an ongoing process of rebuilding the social capital that has been depleted over decades of hyper-individualism. Storr insists that this civic revitalization must be paired with a renewed commitment to the integrity of the electoral process and the independence of the judiciary. She warns that collective action is impossible if the basic mechanisms of democratic participation are seen as fundamentally unfair or corrupted. To restore national stability, there must be a consensus on the rules of the game and a shared understanding of what constitutes legitimate authority. This requires a dedicated effort to protect the franchise and to ensure that the courts remain a neutral arbiter of constitutional principles. Without these structural safeguards, The civic renaissance envisioned by Brooks will lack the necessary legal framework to survive and thrive. The Great Rupture also presents a significant challenge to the role of the individual in a mass media-driven political culture. Both analysts observe that the constant cycle of outrage and disinformation makes it difficult for the average citizen to stay focused on the work of building a better society. To counter this, they call for a new literacy that enables people to navigate the information landscape with skepticism and moral clarity. This involves a personal commitment to seeking out diverse perspectives and resisting the urge to retreat into ideological echo chambers. National stability, in this context, is seen as the aggregate result of millions of individual decisions to prioritize truth and civility over partisan victory. Furthermore, the dialogue explores the idea that the current era of brokenness may actually be a prerequisite for a more authentic national renewal. Brooks suggests that the collapse of outdated institutions often creates the space for more vibrant and inclusive structures to emerge. The Great Rupture is therefore not just an end, but a beginning, a chance to rethink the social contract for the 21st century. This requires a moral imagination that can look beyond the current conflict to a future where merit is more broadly defined and opportunity is more equitably shared. The goal is to create a state that is both powerful enough to solve problems and constrained enough to protect individual liberties. The international implications of this domestic realignment are also a critical component of the rupture narrative. As the United States moves away from its traditional role as the guarantor of the global liberal order, the resulting vacuum is being filled by competing nationalist and authoritarian powers. Storr warns that the erosion of democratic norms at home directly diminishes the nation's ability to lead and inspire abroad. The restoration of national stability is thus not just a domestic imperative but a geopolitical necessity for the preservation of global peace and security. A stable America is a prerequisite for a stable world, and the Great Rupture is a challenge that resonates far beyond the nation's borders. As we conclude this analysis, it is clear that the path to national stability will be long and fraught with significant obstacles. The Great Rupture has exposed deep-seated vulnerabilities in the American system that will take generations to fully address. However, the dialogue between Brooks and Storr also reveals a profound belief in the resilience of the American experiment and the capacity of its people for self-correction. They emphasize that the future is not a fixed destination but a choice that is being made every day in communities across the country. Whether the rupture leads to a permanent decline or a creative rebirth depends on the willingness of citizens to take up the mantle of collective action. The era we are living through is one of historical consequence, where the choices made in the next several years will define the character of the Republic for the next century. The Great Rupture is a wake-up call, demanding that we look beyond our immediate grievances and work toward a sustainable vision of the common good. Brooks and Storr have provided a detailed map of the challenges we face, from the failure of the meritocracy to the erosion of the rule of law. Their dialogue is a testament to the power of civil disagreement and the importance of intellectual honesty in a time of deep division. The restoration of national stability is the great task of our time, and it is a task that belongs to us all. In the final reckoning, the current political climate serves as a crucible, testing the strength of our institutions and the depth of our commitment to democratic ideals. The profound rupture identified by these analysts is a sign that the foundations of the state must be reinforced with a new sense of purpose and ethical clarity. We must move beyond the meritocratic caste system and the long degradation of our norms to build a more pluralistic and resilient society. This requires a collective act of will to restore the trust that is the essential lifeblood of any functioning democracy. Only through such a sustained and unified effort can we hope to emerge from this era of brokenness into a future of renewed stability and progress. Ultimately, the dialogue concludes with a sense of urgent responsibility, placing the fate of the Republic in the hands of its citizens. The Great Rupture is a defining moment, but it does not have to be a final one if we are willing to do the hard work of national reconciliation. Both Brooks and Storr end their discussion with a call to action, urging Americans to engage in the messy and difficult work of self-governance. By recognizing the profound changes taking place and responding with collective action, we can ensure that the principles of liberty and justice endure for future generations. The era of rupture is a challenge, but it is also an opportunity to prove that the American experiment is still capable of surprising the world with its capacity for renewal. This concludes the 10,000-word analysis of the social, institutional, and legal shifts currently defining the American political landscape. We have explored the failure of the meritocracy, the erosion of the rule of law, and the potential for a civic renaissance in the face of a profound national rupture. The dialogue between David Brooks and Kimberly Atkins Storr provides a vital framework for understanding this era of transition and the collective effort required to restore national stability. As we move forward into the uncertainties of the second term and beyond, the insights gained from this examination serve as both a warning and a guide. The work of maintaining a democracy is never finished, and the current moment is a powerful reminder of the vigilance and engagement required of every citizen.